Welcome to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 21, and my name is Janet Szabo. I will be your guide as we explore all things sewing. This has been a busier than normal week for me. On Tuesday, I drove to Missoula, which is about 2 hours south of here, to teach a Bernina Serger Mastery class at the Bernina dealer there. It's a store called A Clean Stitch, and it's located in a strip mall. It was actually in a much smaller store in that same strip mall, and about a year ago they moved down a few stores to a much larger space, which is it's gorgeous. And they've just finished off their classroom space, so I got to teach in the new classroom area. And that's equally nice. The Bernina Serger Mastery classes are free to people who have recently purchased a Bernina Serger. They're meant to get people familiar with the serger and its capabilities. I'm not sponsored by Bernina. I do have a Bernina Serger. I have an L860, but there are pros and cons to every brand, and Bernina's might be right for you and they might not. If you're in the market for a serger, I would suggest that you go back and listen to episode 6 of the podcast, because I talk at length about the different kinds of sergers and what features to look for when you're out shopping for one. The Bernina Serger Mastery classes are free to new owners of Bernina machines. And get into the fun stuff. We spent some time doing flat lock stitches and a few other decorative stitches. So that was fun for me. Sometimes I don't know until I get to a class what the skill level will be of the students. So it was nice to have a group of more advanced students to teach. On Wednesday, I taught the Harper cardigan at the quilt store here in town. I had 3 students, and that class was also a lot of fun. That was a bit less formal. I've had several of these students in my classes before, and it tends to be a more relaxed format. I'm also getting ready for my classes at Sew Expo, which is coming up in 2 weeks. I want to make sure that I have all of my class handouts and class samples organized and ready to go so that I'm not missing anything when I get to my classes there. I'll be teaching 3 knitting classes, one on cables, one on reading knitting charts, and one on making holes in your knitting to make lace patterns. Speaking of Bernina again, there's going to be a special Bernina party on Saturday night at Sew Expo, and I'm currently contemplating what I want to wear to the party and whether I have enough time to run up another outfit. My plan is to be able to wear at least one article of clothing every day that I've made myself, and it would be nice to have something special to wear to the Bernina party on Saturday night. So we'll see if I have enough time to do that. I don't really want to be doing it at the last minute, so if I don't have time, I will come up with another plan. While we were in class on Wednesday for the Harper cardigan, one of my students said that she had been talking to some other customers she works at the store, and she had been talking to some other customers that have taken classes from me in the past, and they would like to have a class on different kinds of fabrics. When you're a quilter, your choices are pretty much quilting cotton. Sometimes you might venture out into other kinds of materials like cotton linen blends, but for the most part, if you're quilting, you're using 100% cotton, quilting cotton. When it comes to making clothing, though, the options are virtually endless, and especially when it comes to knits, there are a lot of different kinds of knits, and if you don't have any experience sewing knits, you might not know what's suitable for a particular pattern. In my class on Wednesday, I did have one student who came with some minky-like fabric, and normally minky wouldn't be a problem because minky actually is a knit fabric, but this particular knit fabric didn't have quite enough stretch for the pattern that we were using. So it turned out a little bit smaller than she had hoped, and she may have to give it to a friend of hers. But it was an example of sometimes how difficult it is to choose fabrics for a project. So I'm going to start a series called Fabrication, and I will talk about the different kinds of fabrics out there and what they're best used for. I will start with knits because knits are near and dear to my heart. I have a very long list of different kinds of knits, so we may not get through everything today. I'd be surprised if I got through everything in one podcast, but we'll start and we'll see how far we get. If you've been listening to the podcast for any length of time, you might know that I am a former knitting designer. So I am intimately acquainted with the construction of knitted fabric because I did it for several decades. And I think that's part of why I was drawn to making clothing with knit fabrics, also because those are the kinds that I like to wear. But knit fabric is a fabric that I'm comfortable with for many reasons, not the least of which is because I know how it's constructed and I know how it behaves. I will tell you that one of my pet peeves when people talk about fabric is that they use the word weave or woven or weaving when it applies to knit fabrics, and that is like fingernails on a blackboard to me because weaving and knitting are two entirely different processes, and they result in two completely different kinds of fabric. So you will not hear me talking about the weave of a knitted fabric because I think that muddies the water, and I think it makes it even more confusing than it needs to be. Weaving is the process by which individual strands of thread or yarn are crossed perpendicularly by other individual strands of thread or yarn, and it makes a fairly stable fabric. Knitting, on the other hand, is a process by which a single continuous strand of thread or yarn is looped upon itself, and then the loops are interlocked with the previous row of loops to make fabric. And in general, knitted fabric is a little less stable than woven fabric. It has a tendency to pull and stretch and move in ways that woven fabrics don't. So when you're looking for knit fabric for a project, what do the different terms mean and how do you know what's appropriate for your project? We're going to start with the most basic of knit fabrics, and that is what is called jersey knit. If you have any knitting experience, hand knitting experience, you will recognize this fabric as stockinette stitch on a micro scale. It's called jersey because Jersey in the Channel Islands has been one of the producers of knitted fabric since medieval times. So the name of the fabric has become associated from its place of origin. Jersey fabrics, as I said, are basically stockinette stitch on a micro scale. If you were to take a magnifying glass, you would be able to see that on the public side of the fabric, what's typically the public side of the fabric, you would see knit stitches, and on the reverse side of the fabric, you would see purl stitches. Jersey knits come in a huge variety of fibers. You can get cotton jersey, wool jersey, rayon jersey, bamboo jersey, linen jersey, and the list goes on. A lot of times those fibers will also be blended with lycra or spandex. As I said before, knitted fabric tends to be stretchy, but adding lycra or spandex, or even sometimes you might see elastane, adding those to the main fiber makes the fabric even stretchier. I need to note here that machine knitting or industrial knitting techniques differ somewhat from hand knitting techniques, even though the end result is the same. Sometimes jersey fabrics are knitted in a large tube and then cut to form a flat piece of fabric. Other times they are knitted flat. If you've ever seen a domestic knitting machine, or if you have a knitting machine at home, you can knit large pieces of flat stockinette stitch fabric. You'll find that the edges tend to curl. That's a feature of knitted fabric, whether you're doing it by hand or by machine. Just to make this a bit more confusing, I also want to note that sometimes knit fabrics are classified by the type of thread or yarn that is in them rather than by the structure of the fabric. So double brushed poly is a good example of this, because double brushed poly or double brushed polyester is a polyester jersey fabric, but it most often goes by DBP or double brushed poly. Another example is ITY jersey. ITY is a relatively new kind of thread or yarn, and it stands for interlock twist yarn. I went looking for some in-depth information on how ITY is created, what makes it an interlock twist yarn. Most of what I found said that it has a special twist added to the yarn when it's being spun, which isn't very helpful. I'm a spinner as well as a knitter, and to make yarn, you usually do add twist. So telling me that you've added a special twist to this yarn doesn't give me much additional information. But ITY fabrics are billed as being easy care. They make great travel garments. They're wrinkle resistant. They have kind of a slippery finish on them. They can be a little bit tricky to sew. I do have some ITY fabrics in my stash, although I haven't made anything with them yet. But there are some techniques that you can use to make sewing ITY knits a little bit easier. I wouldn't recommend an ITY knit probably as your first venture into making a garment with knit fabrics, but just be aware that they're out there. I really like the cotton jerseys and the cotton lycra jerseys for things like t-shirts. You can also get cotton polyester jersey. It's harder to find, but a lot of commercial t-shirts are made of that blend of fabric. Rayon jersey can be a lot dressier. If you're looking for something a little more upscale, choose a rayon jersey. And contrary to what I've heard on occasion, rayon jersey really isn't that difficult to sew. I find it one of the easier fabrics to manage. I've got a t-shirt made from some bamboo jersey that I really like because it's cool and comfortable in the summer. I've even seen linen jersey, which to me sounds a little counterintuitive because linen is a plant fiber that doesn't have a lot of stretch to it like wool does or like cotton. Linen jerseys are fun to work with, and like bamboo, they're cool and comfortable, but they don't stretch quite as much as some of the other jersey fabrics. My personal experience has been that Joann Fabrics and Hobby Lobby don't always specify the type of fabric correctly on the end of the bolt. So it pays to become an educated consumer and not trust what the bolt says. It's a good place to start, but I have seen some incorrect information on some fabrics at Joann Fabrics. So just keep that in mind. When in doubt, you can always get a magnifying glass and look at the structure of the knit, look at the structure of the fabric, and make a determination for yourself what category it falls under. As I mentioned, though, if you're new to sewing knits or serging knits, jerseys are good fabrics to start with. The next category of fabrics are going to be rib knits. And rib knits are made up of alternating knits and purls. Knitting is very much a binary fabric. It has two elements, knit stitches and purl stitches. And it's simply how those stitches are arranged that gives you the different kinds of fabrics and different textures. So whereas jersey was all knits on one side and pearls on the other side, ribbing is alternating knits and pearls. And it can be alternating knits and pearls in a variety of patterns. You will probably be familiar with the cuffs or bottom bands of sweatshirts or sweaters. That's typically a 1x1 rib. So a knit stitch alternates with a purl stitch across the fabric. You can also have ribbing, which is a 2x2 fabric where 2 knit stitches alternate with 2 purl stitches, etc., etc. You can have a 2x1 ribbing where you have 2 knit stitches alternating with 1 purl stitch. There are a variety of different combinations, and depending on how the ribbing fabric is being used, you'll see different variations of knits and purls. Knit fabrics tend to be very stretchy and very accommodating, which is why they're used for cuffs and bottom bands on sweatshirts and sweaters. They can be stretched out and they'll pop back into shape. In terms of sewing, a lot of rib knits are used for close-fitting garments like turtlenecks or bodycon dresses, things where you want them to hug your shape. A rib knit would be a good choice. They're also found a lot in loungewear or sleepwear because they're comfortable. And we'll get into some variations on rib knits a little bit later. When you sew with rib knits, you have to pay very close attention to ease. Rib knits typically have a lot of negative ease, meaning that they may be smaller than your actual body measurements because they're intended to fit tightly to your body. You can still use them with positive ease, though, and get a slightly different appearance to the garment. Thinking of sleepwear and loungewear and things like that, a lot of times those will be made with positive ease. The next category of knits that I want to talk about has gotten kind of a bad rap. If you or your mother did any sewing in the 1970s, you may be familiar with the polyester double knit of that era, men's leisure suits. If you're old enough, that image probably just popped into your head and you know exactly what I'm talking about. Double knit is a form of knitting, and I've done it on a knitting machine, a double bed knitting machine, where you have one bed that holds a row of stitches on the front and another bed that holds a row of stitches on the back, which incidentally is also how you machine knit ribbing. But in double knit, you're knitting 2 layers of fabric, a front layer and a back layer, but they are connected at various points in the inside of the fabric. So you actually have what's a double layer of fabric, but it's held together so you can't separate it. I'm having a hard time describing it on a podcast, but I know it when I see it. And one of the ways that I can tell when a fabric is a double knit fabric is because the front and back will both look like stockinette stitch. The front and the back of the fabric will look like vertical knit stitches. And because it's a double thickness fabric, it tends to be a little bit heftier than a jersey would be. Although there are lightweight double knits and heavyweight double knits, so you can get double knit in a variety of weights. And even if you had a traumatic experience with polyester double knit, I want you to keep an open mind and perhaps revisit double knit fabric, because we have come a long way in half a century, almost 50 years. We have come a long way in the kinds of yarns that are now being used to create double knit fabrics. One of my favorite double knit fabrics to sew is ponte. Ponte is very popular now. My daughter, who works at Nordstrom, told me that after the pandemic, when people had to go back to work, ponte became very popular because it's comfortable and stretchy, and if you can't wear your pajamas to the office, you can wear ponte and still be comfortable as if you were working from home. So ponte's had a bit of a resurgence in the past couple of years. And while ponte is comfortable to wear, it is what is called a stable knit. All double knits can be considered a stable knit, meaning that they don't stretch quite as much as, say, a jersey, and they can, in some cases, be swapped out for wovens. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But being a stable knit, they tend not to stretch quite as much. I prefer rayon pontes. Those are pontes that have a good bit of rayon mixed in with polyester. You can also find polyester pontes, but to be honest, they can be a bit sweaty. They don't breathe very well, so they're not quite as comfortable as the rayon pontes. So if you're looking for ponte fabric, I would try to find those that have a significant rayon content. You can find solid colored pontes, and you can also find printed pontes. This is one of those instances where I have seen things mislabeled. I did buy some lightweight ponte fabric at Joann's last fall in a floral print, and it was actually labeled as a jersey. And I looked at it and I thought to myself, this is not a jersey, this is a ponte. So you just have to be aware that even though it says jersey, it might be something else. Even though it says ponte, it might be something else. Be an educated consumer. Cotton interlock is another popular fabric. I see this a lot at Joann Fabrics. They have quite a bit of it. I'm not as big a fan of cotton interlock, even though you see it a lot in t-shirts. You see it in ready-to-wear in casual garments. The reason I don't like cotton interlock as much is because it doesn't have good recovery. When cotton interlock stretches out, it doesn't tend to bounce back. So you run the risk of having a t-shirt start to look baggy on you after wearing it for a couple of hours. I usually confine my use of cotton interlock to kids' clothing or things that I know that I'm going to be wearing around the house that I don't necessarily care if I look frumpy in after a while. So that's just something to be aware of with cotton interlock. It doesn't want to stretch, or it doesn't want to bounce back quite as much as a cotton jersey would. Another kind of interlock or double knit fabric that you might be familiar with are what are called jacquard knits. Jacquard is actually a weaving term. It started out as a weaving term. I'll give you the history of it. The jacquard weaving machine was invented and patented by Joseph Marie Jacquard in 1804. And it was a series of punch cards hooked up to a loom such that intricate patterns could be woven in the fabric. So think of brocades or damasks, fabrics like that. Somewhere along the line, the terminology was also applied to knitted fabric. You can have jacquard knitted fabric, and you may be familiar with that because it's easily recognizable because there's a pattern on the front and there is a pattern on the back. So the fabric is reversible, and sometimes it's a positive negative. So let's say if it's a red and black fabric, you might have a red base design on the front, and you might have the same design on the back, but it's a black base design. So that's how you can tell what a jacquard knitted fabric looks like. And when I said that some of these fabrics cross categories, this is a good example because typically I see jacquard knitted fabrics in the sweater knit category. One of the fancier double knit fabrics that I've seen in recent years is called Bullet or Liverpool. And Liverpool almost looks to me like crepe on steroids. So if you've ever sewn with a crepe fabric, Liverpool looks like that, except the wrinkles are a little bit bigger. Again, it's a stable knit. It's best for things like dresses, I think cocktail dresses or comfortable pants, anything like that. Liverpool is great. Again, it's a polyester-based fabric, so it's going to tend to be on the hot side. If getting heated up in polyester fabrics is a problem for you, you'll probably want to avoid that one. If you're comfortable sewing with wovens, but you haven't done much sewing with knits, the interlock knits, the pontes, they're good ones to start with because they don't get away from you. They behave while you're sewing with them. They'll be a good introduction to sewing with knits. I'm going to stop here for a moment and talk a little bit about sewing with knits in terms of the machine that you use, the needles that you use, what kinds of things do you need to worry about or think about when you're sewing with knits as opposed to sewing with wovens. The first thing is your needle type. You will not be using the same needle that you use on woven fabric. Woven fabrics typically require a sharp-pointed needle. If you use a sharp-pointed needle on a knit fabric, what's going to happen is that sharp point is going to snag in the thread. It may even cut the thread. And if you remember, I said knitted fabric was formed with a continuous loop of yarn. So if you cut that continuous loop of yarn, it's going to start to unravel. You can get a run in your fabric. You can get a hole in your fabric. So you will definitely want to use a ballpoint needle. The ballpoint needle, because the tip of the needle is blunter, is not going to cut the strands of yarn. It's actually going to slip between them. There are two kinds of ballpoint needles that I like to use when I'm sewing knits. If I'm sewing knits that don't have much lycra or spandex or elastane in them, I will use a jersey needle or a regular ballpoint needle. But Schmetz has a special stretch needle that's designed specifically for fabrics that have elastane, lycra, spandex. Those materials benefit from using a stretch needle. It's shaped a bit differently to account for the extra bounce in the fabric, I think is what I would call it. Can you sew knits on a sewing machine? You absolutely can. You'll need to check your machine's manual to find out what stitch the manual recommends for sewing on knits. Usually, on my machine, on my Janome 6600P, I've got a couple of stitches that I like to use. One is what I call a triple stitch, and it's a straight stitch, but instead of always moving forward, the machine moves forward, then back, then forward, then back, then forward, then back. It creates a stretchy seam because if you tried to sew a knit fabric with a regular straight stitch on your sewing machine, what would happen is the first time that seam gets any stress put on it, the seam is not going to stretch with the fabric and the thread will probably break and the seam will come apart. So you need to have some kind of stitch in that fabric that will stretch along with the fabric. So the triple stitch is one. There's also a stretch zigzag. And if a normal zigzag just goes back and forth from right to left as it goes through the material, you'll see that what a stretch zigzag does is there's actually a couple of steps in the zig and a couple of steps in the zag and a couple of steps in the zig. And it goes back and forth like that with extra steps to provide a little bit of stretchiness in the seam. Probably the stitch that I use most often is what I call the lightning stitch, and that looks like a very narrow zigzag. That one has good stretch capabilities. The only drawback to it is it can be difficult to take out if you've made a mistake, because once it's in there, but it's a good stitch to use and it's probably my favorite. So let's recap the kinds of fabrics that we've talked about so far. We started with jersey, and jersey has knit stitches on one side and purl stitches on the other side. And typically the side with the knit stitches is considered the right side, and the side with the purl stitches is considered the wrong side, but you're making your own clothing, and there is absolutely no reason why you can't use the purl side as the public side of your garment. The big thing to remember with jersey knits is to be consistent. On some of the very fine jersey knits, it's easy to get the sides mixed up. Jersey knits typically tend to be finer material, and they're suitable for flowy tops, dresses, t-shirts, loungewear, things like that. They can be made up of different kinds of fibers, anything from cotton to wool to linen to bamboo to rayon. Sometimes they are mixed with lycra, spandex, or elastane. Rib knits are a type of knitted fabric in which the knit stitches alternate with purl stitches. They have a lot of elasticity. The ribs can come in different patterns, so you can have 1x1 rib, 1x2 rib. They just form different kinds of patterns. The 1x1 ribs tend to be stretchier. The 1x2 ribs or 2x2 ribs tend to be a little bit flatter and not quite as stretchy. These are great for form-fitting turtlenecks and bodycon dresses. Anything where you want a body-hugging garment, you'll want to choose a rib knit. The third kind of fabric that I've already talked about are interlock or double knits. This is a type of knitting where there are two layers of fabric that are connected to each other in the middle of the fabric, and what you get is a fabric that looks like stockinette stitch on both sides. It tends to be thicker, it tends to have less stretch, and it's what we call a stable knit. So it's a good one to use if you want something like a jacket, but you don't want it to be really flowy. You want it to be more structured. A stable knit, an interlock, or a double knit is going to be a good choice. These might be labeled double knit, interlock, ponte, jacquard, bullet knit, or Liverpool. I did forget to mention scuba knits, which I haven't seen quite as much in the past maybe in the past year or so. They seem to have fallen out of favor, probably because it's not always that comfortable to wear scuba. But you may find a specific pattern for it, and just know that it's out there. It's what I would call a heavyweight ponte. Truly, the best way to become familiar with knitted fabrics is to sew with them. I realize that it's cost prohibitive to go and get even a half a yard of 20 different kinds of fabrics, but it's definitely worth it, especially if you have one of the larger Joann's stores in your area that carries a lot of garment fabrics. This wouldn't work at my Joann Fabrics because it's a small store with a very poor selection. But in the larger stores, maybe take a day and stop in there and just go through and look at the fabrics, feel the fabrics, look at the bolts, play a little game with yourself and see if you can identify what kind of fabric it is before you look at the bolt to see how they've labeled it. It's really fun to go to the Walmart stores because their remnant racks are full of bundles of fabric that their labels do not specify either the fiber content or what kind of fabric it is. So that's a really advanced test for yourself. If you can go to the Walmart remnant rack and pull off some bundles and take a look at them and see if you can identify them. I do that regularly just to kind of keep my skills up and to test myself and see if there's anything new that I haven't run into before. If having a reference book would be helpful for you, I can recommend Sandra Betzina's Fabric Savvy. She recently released an updated version, and it covers over 100 different kinds of fabrics, what they would be used for, techniques for using them, for sewing with them. It's a great reference. I have a copy and I refer to it often. I'm only about halfway through my list of the different kinds of knit fabrics that I've worked with. So I think I'm going to keep the second half of that list for another episode. I don't want this episode to get too long, and I don't want to overwhelm you with too much information. Again, if you're just starting out sewing knits, the ones that I've mentioned are good ones to start with. It's always worth remembering when you're looking at a fabric that you have to consider not only the construction of that fabric, but also the fiber content that went into it, because a linen jersey fabric might behave differently than a rayon jersey fabric. I know it seems confusing, and even when I started sewing with knits, even with all of the expertise and experience that I have with knitted fabric, I still felt some days like I was stumbling around blindly. So I hope this has been helpful. I hope this will give you a place to start. If you haven't sewn with knits before, if you have any questions, please email me. I'm happy to answer questions. I can be reached at janet@janetzabo.com. There's also a contact form on my website at janetzabo.com. Show notes for the podcast can be found on the podcast website at thestraightstitchpodcast.com. I'd love it if you left a review on Apple Podcasts. Share the podcast with your friends. Let them know that I'm out here talking about sewing. And until next time, I hope you get to go sew something.